Any of you guys remember something called Brexit? Welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to all those people who have subscribed and liked us recently. And we have got a fantastic panel of guest speakers this time. Most of them you've heard on the podcast before. We have a lineup of some of our brilliant former MEPs. We have Sheila Ritchie from Scotland, Anthony Hook, I was going to say South East, I think that's right. We have Shaffaq Mohammed from Yorkshire, and we have Caroline Voaden, the former leader of the group of Lib Dem MEPs. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much for coming on. How are you all doing?
Good, thanks,
surviving.
John.
Very good, thanks. Strange times.
Strange times, and I suppose that leads naturally to worrying times as well, Caroline. And I wonder if you could start. So, I mean, looking at the news, the Tories seem hell-bent on just crashing out of Europe. They don't seem to have any sort of plan to get a trade negotiation. What's your impressions of what's going on at the moment?
Well, we're recording this the day before the deadline for extending the transition, which would be the 30th of June. And it's plainly obvious that they're not going to ask for an extension. And it seems to me that coronavirus has given the Conservatives the perfect cover for a complete Brexit nightmare, because they will now be able to blame, any economic consequences on the pandemic, because we're going to be in such dire straits anyway. And I think we would say that it gives us even more reason not to do it than before, whereas the Conservatives will say, well, actually we can move on with Brexit and just hide all the damage it does under the pandemic and pretend it's nothing to do with Brexit. So I think, any government, however good the government was and whatever colour or flavour it was, any government would have been completely sidelined by this pandemic, as we've seen. There hasn't been room or space or bandwidth to really think about anything else. So it seems to me even more ludicrous than ever that we press ahead with Brexit when nobody's been able to concentrate on the negotiations and attention has been elsewhere. And not just for us, that goes for the other side as well. And just the last thing I would say is that the whole idea of the transition period, of having this year between leaving and then kind of leaving again, I don't know how to phrase that better, but that transition period was meant for businesses particularly to have a year to prepare. But businesses still don't know what they're preparing for, because they still don't know what the agreement's going to be. And they haven't been able to even start thinking about it because they've all been in, COVID panic, trying to just keep themselves afloat. So the transition period has been, not for anybody, the fault of anybody, but it's been completely sidelined by the pandemic. And, and now we're facing a prospect of businesses having to cope with these two things, one on top of the other. It just feels to me like the ultimate, if you want to really screw your economy as badly as you possibly can, then follow the Johnson model, because nobody else would be able to do it any better.
And everything that Caroline says about businesses is equally true of human beings. We're no further on about knowing what the rights of EU citizens are going to be in the United Kingdom. We're no further on, therefore, about knowing what the rights of UK citizens are going to be in European Union countries. We've no idea what the travel rules are going to be. That's obviously hugely exacerbated by coronavirus and quarantines and not quarantines, and the fact that ferry travel and air travel have been restricted practically down to zero. And nobody is bothering to look at the long-term planning on this. You have to come to the conclusion that the stuff that Mark Francois is putting out on this new platform, social media platform, is true, and that the plan for Leavers always was a no-deal Brexit. We always feared it. In the run-up to both the extension to the 31st of December and during the general election campaign, we consistently said no deal is still part of this. And bluntly, nobody was listening. And we're in the mess that we're in, with probably the most incompetent government since before the Second World War, trying to deal with two enormous crises at once, and at the same time sacking the civil service. It's just absolutely nuts.
In a sense, and I agree with everything my colleagues have said, the Conservatives' communications have had two tracks, or the Brexiteers' communications have had two tracks. There was an internal one, which you could pick up if you listened very carefully, and there was the public-facing one. So as the general election approached in November, December, at the end of last year, there were, or even actually before that in October, when Boris came back with his supposed withdrawal agreement, a lot of the hardline Eurosceptics who'd opposed the Theresa May agreement were brought on side to support the Johnson agreement with a promise that this was a bridge to no deal. That get this, to pass this, and we pass something, and then we'll get no deal later down the line. And you can find instances of Conservative MPs saying that in explicit terms, and certainly in the European Parliament. I remember hearing the Brexit Party MEPs who ended up splitting. Some of them wanted to support Johnson, some not. The ones who particularly wanted to support Johnson, that was exactly what they were saying. But having said that, the public-facing Conservative message stayed very different. I can remember in January doing a Radio Kent interview with Peter Lilly on the other side, hardline Eurosceptic Conservative peer. And he was utterly dismissive about, no, won't be a no deal, we'll get it, wonderful deal. And all through the general election campaign, the Conservative mantra was get Brexit done. And when they were pushed on it, they were always insistent there would be another deal that would make our dreams come true, blah, blah, blah. And so I think it will be quite legitimate if we do end up with no deal at the end of this year, which seems very likely. On the one hand, it shouldn't be surprising given what the Conservatives were saying if you listen carefully. But on the other hand, I think we should politically attack them very strongly and say this is not what you promised the British people and no one voted for this.
I mean, look, I think COVID will give them the cover for any fallout from Brexit will now be blamed on COVID. So, the downturn in the economy, it's not because we left Europe, it's because of the coronavirus, etc. And whilst everybody's talking about no deal, I think, look at the politics of it. And I've got a feeling the likes of Cummings and that will say, we want everything in name, no deal. But actually, we need a piece of paper that says deal. So we can say, actually, we negotiated a deal. So what I think will happen is at some point in the next 6 months, there'll be a piece of paper that says withdrawal agreement deal. And it will be absolutely wafer thin. And it might not have the details that we're wanting about the status of EU nationals in our country or our British citizens living in Europe or the fishing agreements or, in my case, the steel industry in Sheffield and Yorkshire as a whole. That sort of stuff is going to be wafer thin. And basically, it'll be what the Conservatives like Francois and others wanted, which is in essence a no deal. But I think politically what they'll do for cover, they'll say, we've got a deal. And all the bad things that are going to happen, the downturn in the economy, I'm feeling it already, if I'm being honest. A lot of people are on furlough at the moment. National insurance is about to kick in August. In October, I see masses of people being laid off from work. And as a result, all of that, some of that is obviously corona, but some of it's uncertainty about investment. And I just see that the Tories have got the cover that they'll be wanting. They were always wanting a no deal, but they're going to have a wafer thin piece of paper saying deal. And any fallout will be, well, look, there's a worldwide recession, just like Gordon Brown and Co said in 2008. And on the people who are going to be affected are those at the bottom. Those that can least afford Brexit and those that can least afford. And I really fear for them right up and down the country, whether it's in Scotland or in the southwest where Caroline is, in Kent where Anthony is, or in Yorkshire and Humber where I am. Right across this country, the most vulnerable are going to feel the effects of what Johnson, Cummings, and the Rees-Moggs of this world are going to get their way.
And do you think? Go on, Sheila.
I was going to say, the four of us were in another discussion a little while ago, in which we were mooting the possibility that the deal that Shaffaq is talking about, the wafer thin deal, will have a clause that says, and everything else can be negotiated later. And I think that's entirely possible, but it will be can rather than will. And they are basically going to let entire industries, the one that is not enormous but seems to carry huge political weight, is the fishing industry. The fishing industry is going to be absolutely left to sink. Not to swim, just to sink. And the fishermen who have been so much in favour of leave are going to be absolutely left to hang out to dry. It's just outrageous.
Did you see the other day, the Daily Express had June Mummery. They did a big thing with her. So she was Brexit Party MEP who was always banging on about fishing, and she and I had several run-ins about it. And she was going on about how this is going to make the fishing industry, you know, the saviour of Britain, and we're going to have create thousands of jobs in our coastal communities. And somehow I just couldn't quite work out what the connection is, you know, that if I don't know what she's expecting them to come up with, but it's certainly not going to be the deal she wants. And, you know, unless people in Britain all start eating fish that they've never eaten before in their lives, and completely changing their taste and changing the way I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Look, Caroline, this is the same June. Remember, I think it was in January when it dawned on her that we were going to be leaving the European Parliament, that tweeted that famous tweet that, hang on, when we're gone, who's going to be speaking up for the Brits on the fishing committee? And I thought, light bulb moment.
Committee meetings.
I mean, I don't know if you saw that, John, but I say to everyone listening to us, Google it. It was a classic. You know, we were in stitches to say that the chief Brexiteer, you know, the Brexit Party itself, the MEPs are now asking, hang on, who's going to be here shouting, fighting our corner when we're gone on fishing and many other industries? So, you know, it's a bit rich for the likes of June Murray now to be talking about fishing when actually they're the ones who sabotaged that industry, I would say, in the sense of by leaving. You know, we had something that worked, and they seem to have, you know, favoured leaving, and now they're asking, you know, they'll be asking questions, what about our fishing industry? Well, you should have thought of that before you campaigned to leave the European Union.
The thing that really irritates me about the fishing argument is that, you know, none of it is to do with Brexit. You know, we sold our fishing quotas to Spanish and French boats, and we did that, I don't know, in the 70s, I think it was. And, you know, that goes way back, and we can't get them back because we can't just say, oh, please, can we have our fishing quotas back? Because we don't want you to have them anymore. You know, we sold them and the quotas went with the boats. So it's just a completely nonsensical argument to say that it's all because of Brexit. I mean, it's all because of the EU. Obviously, there have been decisions made over the years which haven't been entirely beneficial to the British fishing industry. But that was the catastrophic one, was selling the quotas. And she never mentions that. She never talks about it.
Anthony, I think you want to come in?
Yeah, I say a couple. I mean, it's really interesting because I remember that episode in January that Shaff was talking about where June Mummery was protesting, you know, who'll speak up for Britain when you guys carry on making these decisions that will still affect us, which, you know, would be funny if it wasn't so serious. But I think one difference between LDEP, the ex-Lib Dem MEPs, and probably the Brexit MEPs is, to an extent, we've still got links in. I mean, I'm still in our WhatsApp group of all the Renew is the family of liberal groups in Europe, all the Renew MEPs on LIBE, which is the Justice Committee that I was on. So, and they know I'm there, and I read the discussions and sometimes join in the discussions. I make a point of not to overdo it because I feel like I'm a visitor now rather than a member, quite literally. So I feel I should do it sparingly, but occasionally I do offer a view, and I feel like I'm in a sense the valued member of the team. And I know that if I wanted to get some information, I've got my friends there, the other MEPs in the Renew LIBE group, but also one of my assistants is now working for another MEP. And I haven't used that, but I could ring her if there was a piece of information I desperately wanted. I know within reason, as long as I didn't abuse it, she would be helpful to me. So we've still got ever so slightly a connection in, whereas the Brexit MEPs won't have, I think, anything like that.
I think that's right.
Is important.
Yeah, and we've got, Sheila and I are both members of a huge WhatsApp group which was set up at the beginning of the term for all the women in Renew. So I think there are, how many is it? About 100 people in that group?
I don't think it's quite that many because there were only 100 altogether. About 50 maybe.
Okay, about 50. So yes, there were about 110 Renew MEPs, weren't there? So about half of them. And most of it is just chat, but we do talk about Brexit, and Brexit issues come up, you know, and they ask us questions. So all of the 9 Lib Dem women are all in that group. So it's a really good way to have sort of access in. If we want to ask questions or ask for support on an issue, then we can go in there and talk to our friends.
And they take our guidance as well, because 3 or 4 of them are quite commonly used by the British media as the voice of the European Union in Brexit negotiations, particularly Nathalie Loiseau from France. And they will come on and say, we're doing the Today programme tomorrow. This is likely to be the topic of conversation. I'm thinking of saying this. And I mean, there's a real sense of family and community, I think, across Renew generally, but certainly with the Renew ladies. And it's really useful to have those links. And it's, sorry, I'm feeling a little bit emotional at the moment. It's really sad that we can't work with them the way that we were historically. It's truly, truly awful, and not to the benefit of the United Kingdom.
Can I ask you guys what the impression is you're getting from the European side of how the negotiations are going? Because obviously we know Boris and his team are all bluster and I completely agree with Shaffaq. I think they'll probably do some sort of wafer thin, 1-page sort of statement and say, look, this is our deal. And how's it from you? I mean, I was surprised before the general election that the EU gave them that deal in the first place. I think it obviously it helped the Tories immensely, saying, look, we have this oven-ready deal. I mean, in fact, it was just the existing deal, but screwing over the DUP. So what impressions are you getting from the EU?
Well, I've heard from... Sorry, Natalie has said that she's always had the impression that the Brits weren't really negotiating at all. You know, they were coming to the meetings and they weren't really trying to meet in the middle. They were just coming saying, this is what we want, which was, you know, a lot of it was completely sort of unrealistic.
Yeah.
With no serious intention of actually having a proper negotiation. And I think they really seriously wanted us to ask for an extension, because none of them feel that they're ready or we're ready to do it. But they couldn't make us ask for an extension. So
could they offer us an extension, or are they not going to do that?
They have done. They have made it clear that if we ask, they will accept up to 2 years.
Which is even more bonkers than the situation where and like I say, I completely agree with the things that Shaffaq and Caroline said. It's a smokescreen, basically, to try, and they'll use COVID as that. And I mean, the brutal part of it is, and I'd love to hear your view on this, Sheila, is how this then affects particularly Northern Ireland and Scotland going forward. I mean, Scotland's got probably some of the most important elections ever next year, and how the economic turmoil of this plus COVID and everything else, it could seriously break up the union.
I think there's something else that is more likely to break up the union, but the two things do tie together. I think there is, without a shadow of a doubt, there remains a strong view in Scotland that we should be part of the European Union. I think that in itself is unlikely to be a driver next May. But the problem is that the driver is the utter lack of popularity, brackets, detestation, close brackets, of the Conservative government. And I mean, that is absolutely pervasive, to the extent that it's pervasive with Conservative voters as well as with everybody else. And every time Boris does something awful, and you know that's 2 or 3 times a day, the SNP creep up in the opinion polls. The "I do not want to be governed by these idiots" line is everywhere. It's and I think that unless we can make people understand that first of all, the SNP's handling of COVID has actually not been that much better than the Tories. It's just that Nicola puts on a better show, and by goodness, she puts on a better show. Unless we can make people understand that standards in health and education and employment are falling across the whole country, To which the SNP's response generally is, well, we're better than England, which doesn't strike me as being a particularly high bar to seek to cross. Unless we can get those two really, really strong messages across, and of course they are a controlling nationalist government. They are not in any way liberal, and this whole concept of civil or civic nationalism is just nuts. They're now, today, talking about closing the border with England. The excuse, of course, is COVID, but I mean, the reality is it's something that most of them have probably wanted to do all of their nasty little lives. I'm going to get into trouble for saying that on public radio, as it were.
No, well, if there's ever any problem, we could always edit it out. But no, I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast as well. You know, there are too many people in England who think, oh, aren't the SNP cuddly and nice? Yeah. And actually, if you scratch below the surface, they are nationalists. And you've got to remember, and, you know, things like the education report that they've now said are going to delay until after next year's elections because it's so bad. That it's not quite as bad as Johnson not releasing the Russia report. But, you know, the SNP are getting the same tactics. Yeah, well, unless we can deliver that message to a significant additional sector of the Scottish electorate before next May, the fear, the dislike, the visceral detestation of this Conservative government is going to be the thing that puts us in the wrong side of the unionist debate next year. I'm not an enormous fan of the union as it stands, but it's enormously better than independence. And I'm not sure that we can actually move people with a federalist debate, but it's what we stand on, and we need to be very clear that what we're seeking is a federal United Kingdom. Can't speak for Northern Ireland. They can speak for themselves.
Sheila, I'll start to mention Northern Ireland because I was thinking that, because actually some of the promises made about no border checks, well, we're going to have a border in the middle of the Irish Sea, you know, whatever promises were made last year. And given that's going to already start to show the differences between, you know, Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And I was always saying to people that if Brexit happens, it takes unification of Ireland one step closer. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to feel like we're in two different countries. If you've got a border check in the middle of the sea, you know, we don't have there's no proposal for border checks with Wales. And regardless of what SNP want, what Sheila's just told us, there's not likely to be a border with Scotland unless something terrible happens with a second referenda. But the Irish, I'm worried really that our union and people like Guy and that were constantly telling us that you're leaving one union and you're going to put another union at threat. And people just ignored it and didn't think that Guy was serious. And he was serious. That, you know, we've left the European Union thinking we're out of this club and we're going to be okay. But actually, it's going to show the strains that exist within our different parts of our nation, yeah? In the sense that, you know, Sheila's right, you know, the Johnson government's going to be hugely unpopular up north. That's going to really swell the numbers if they didn't need swelling any further, the SNP ranks. That drumbeat for, you know, independence will just grow louder, especially if the economy has a downturn. And similarly in Ireland, you know, the closer alignment between the Republic and Northern Ireland was always going to be the case. And they're going to then start to feel distant. And obviously the other thing will be demographic changes. And people who really don't care won't be as, you know, wanting to be part of the UK. They see themselves as European. They may well have moved to Ireland elsewhere. And I just fear that in the next 30 years, you know, I think unification might be a reality. You know, it's not something I want, but that's what I see coming down the line.
Yeah. Anthony, I was wondering if I could come to you a little bit about, you know, Sheila mentioned about EU citizens, and obviously, and there were a lot of promises about, you know, particularly about the 3 million would all be just automatically transferred, and then they decided, the government reneged on that and said if they didn't sign up for settled status, they would now be unlawful. There's other issues. I mean, we only found out in January, just before the local elections that were supposed to happen, that EU citizens were allowed to vote or stand. It was right up to where, and we still don't know what their rights are going to be after, if we crash out. how important is that going to be for Lib Dems and pro-Europeans to make sure we look after and protect EU citizens in this country as well?
There's a whole set of issues there that we can and should campaign on. And I, as a local councillor, have reached out to my European citizens. We know roughly who they are from the electoral register, and I've written to them directly previously, and probably will do so again as their local councillor. And I think the Conservative policy has been a mess. I think it's also been quite dishonest. And quite often they will say, oh, there's no problem at all. The number of people who've had their settled status application refused is very small, and they trot out various single or double digit numbers. But that's utter spin, because actually there's a very large number of people whose applications haven't been decided. They're just in a kind of limbo. So again, there's quite a loose relationship with the truth there. And the Conservatives, I think, are very split between some individuals in their party who are quite sensible and understand that workers in the EU are very important for the NHS and for parts of business, or certainly for farming. I mean, we see all this stuff about please come and work on the farms, they're really short of labour, and that is a very serious problem in rural England right now. But at the same time, they appeal to this very nationalistic wing which says don't let anybody in. And we talked before quite rightly about how with the SNP you don't have to scratch too far below the surface to find some real unpleasantness, and that's equally true about the Conservatives. And a Conservative in my area who we kicked off the council last May, but he would have become the mayor if we hadn't done that, he was tweeting that students should be conscripted to work in the fields. I mean, these are deeply dangerous people we're up against, and I think we need to take the fight to them however we possibly can.
And does it present an opportunity for Lib Dems? I mean, you've mentioned farming. I was very, I have a fairly ruralish part to my division as well, my county seat, and actually very few opportunities have we had a chance to really hit the Tories in those areas. And actually, as we saw from the agricultural bill, there was a Tory rebellion. Even the Chancellor did it, even though he said it by accident. But the idea that all these promises are now starting to unravel. Yeah. And is that an opportunity for Lib Dems to actually capitalise on this politically? Because if the Tories are going to do this, which they won the general election, we can surely make them pay for the incompetence that they're doing in the consequences.
It's a huge opportunity. And when I was MEP, some of my visits that I would do around the region to different people, we certainly made some farmers visits, and they were very interested in talking to us. Well, I was actually more interested in listening to them and the concerns that they had about Brexit. And there were farmers who voted Remain, and they were saying to me that actually their friends down the road who'd voted Leave were now having real second thoughts. And we saw in the last couple of months statements from the NFU and other bodies that represent farmers deeply concerned about the proposals to let lower quality produce from America come in, that British farmers will actually then be at a competitive disadvantage against. So I think there's a big opportunity for Liberal Democrat campaigners at grassroots level to reach out to farmers and just approach them the same way we would any other residents, with surveys, focuses, with direct letters. And it's all about building up a relationship. I think when you get people who voted one way for a very long time, and that's not true of all farmers, but we know there might be some farmers who say always voted Conservative, and equally you get some people who've always voted Labour. I grew up in a Kent town which was a mining town, and the mines closed in the early 80s, but as recently as say 2012, I remember canvassing a by-election. I remember someone who said, my dad was a miner, I have to vote Labour. But you can break those relationships, and you can in a sense liberate people to think again. But it takes time, it takes effort to say this is us and this is what we stand for, and actually we're the ones who are really on your side.
So I did a couple of round tables last summer with farmers in Somerset and Dorset, and quite a lot of them had voted Brexit, but they wanted to sort of meet me and hear what I had to say, and some of them hadn't. And the thing that I would say that the strongest thing they all had in common was that they all agreed that people did not want to pay enough for food in this country. and that was the threat to British farming, was trying to get people to pay a couple of % more of their weekly budget on food, and that, you know, they were comparing it to places like France and Italy, where people will buy good food, and whereas here people just want to go to Lidl's and get the cheapest possible. But I think, you know, I think for us that's an opportunity, because as more cheap food gets imported, if we go down that route of importing cheap food from America, that is a massive threat to our farmers, and Brexit, whether they voted Brexit or not, if their livelihood is threatened by more and more cheap food, then, you know, that they're going to coalesce around that, and that's something. I mean, I wouldn't say we need to campaign to have artificially inflated food prices and not allow cheap food in, but somehow or other we have to support our farmers in a way that they can produce food that is good food that is affordable.
Sheila?
And maybe, I don't know, I mean, maybe the scope for the Lib Dems to do something on a national scale with farmers from Scotland down to Kent and Penzance, and try and take the temperature of where farmers are at now with regards to Brexit.
The next leader definitely needs a good pair of welly boots, for sure.
Yeah.
Sheila, what are your thoughts on I mean, this is more about, it's not just about farming, but on all sorts of issues that it could lead to an opportunity for the Lib Dems. I know we don't really want to talk about political calculus and these things, because it is going to be people's livelihoods and their lives going forward. But, you know, we don't make change unless we win seats and win power. And next year's elections are the biggest since 1973. So what are your thoughts?
I'm you know, that new political compass thing that came out over the weekend? Yeah. I'm quite far down the disillusion scale. That might be on as a consequence of coronavirus, which I think is affecting everybody's mindset. But I am sceptical about our winning over farmers in large numbers. Because I was on the Agri Committee in the European Union, I developed a pretty good relationship, I thought, with the president of the NFU in Scotland. And I was gobsmacked about the short-termism of their views and their the fact that they were not planning alignment with the EU, even in a post-Brexit world. Because frankly, if farming is not aligned with the EU, whether or not there is any sort of deal done, we will not be exporting our product into the European Union. And they did not seem to have worked through that set of linkages. And that's at a structural level. I went to one NFU, it was a hustings, but it was an NFU hustings, not a political hustings. And it was like walking into something out of the last century. The guys were so focused on people from the towns hate us, they don't understand us, they don't understand that we just give us the subsidies and we'll get on with it, don't worry about us. There was no perception of the requirement to contribute to the climate crisis solutions. There was no perception of the volume of subsidy that they get, for which they basically have nothing to put back except, quote, cheap, unquote, food, because food here is not cheap by comparison with a lot of other places. And that's not a bad thing. I think we should be paying for quality. I might not say that if I was living on benefits with 3 children, but I definitely think we should be paying for quality food. Notwithstanding all of that, I think your average farmer bleeds blue. And I don't think it's the work of half a generation, possibly even a generation, to stop that happening. I think they think that the strength of their lobby, which is not the volume of their lobby, it's nothing to do with the number of farmers, it's entirely to do with monies and possibly to do with super sign sites. It's about the strength of their voice, not the numbers of their voices. I think they still think that they're going to stop this simply by appealing to the people they have always voted for. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think I'm not actually sure we should be talking about Boris Johnson as the leader in all of this. It's clearly Cummings who has turned his face to the wall on anything except market forces. And but having said that, I think one of the opportunities that does arise, if I can move off farming, is to do with buying local. I think COVID has presented us with small shops, local shops, sourcing their produce locally, who have met market demand when the big supermarkets either haven't or have been 150 miles away. I'm talking about the Highlands here. And I think, and there are places like that. I have friends who live in Gairloch. Their nearest Tesco is in Inverness. It's a 5-hour drive to Inverness and back. It's not, you know, this is not a simple solution. So those small shops have absolutely been the lifeblood of the community. And certainly I'm seeing a lot of people locally committing to continue to support them as they have supported us over the last 13 weeks. And I suppose there is also a bit of me that recognises that that is the prerogative of the comfortably off, if not wealthy. If you are driven by budget because you're living on benefits, you are going to buy the cheapest products at the cheapest prices that you can find, because that's how you feed your family. It may, in the final analysis, be a false economy, but it's the only economy you've got to live in.
Yeah.
And Shaffaq, we're talking about the EU and you guys and your experience and everything, but you know, from a global point of view, you know, we've seen the looks like the scrapping of DFID, and I mean, we're talking about we are all fairly reasonable people, but the government is acting in such unreasonable ways and against contrary to all kind of evidence and idea that we can be better as part of a wider group rather than just little old England or Britain. So what is your view on Britain's place in the world now? I
mean, British place in the world is going to be diminished. Us leaving the European Union will be. Us not doing our bit. You know, when we had 0.7% of our GDP for economic, you know, international aid, that was something that we could be proud of and then go and speak to other nations and say, look, this is what we're doing to help. And I remember 15 years ago when we just got elected to the council in Sheffield, a massive earthquake hit South Asia. I live in a very poor part of Sheffield. £87,000 was raised, phenomenal amount. You know, people sold their gold to contribute because they saw the suffering. 3 million people just, you know, kind of displaced, 70,000 died. And it was so proud when you were there 3 weeks in a field kind of camp, just helping in whichever way you could, to see the Union Jack on things, to see, you know, helicopters flying in the sky and you could see the Union Jack underneath them. And that made me really proud to be British. And we came back and as a city, we rebuilt a school and it still exists there. And, you know, people from Sheffield have been and gone there. That's what we're going to lose by just turning our back on them and just saying, yeah, we're just going to look after our own. Because this kind of charity begins at home thing is, well, hang on, if you're not going to show compassion, you know, look what's happening in Yemen at the moment. I don't know if my colleagues saw the 10 o'clock news of the night. One of the last things I did when I was in European Parliament is I had a delegation, and I think Caroline might have met him, I think. A bunch of Yemenis from Sheffield and further afield came to the European Union and said to me, Shaff, we need your help. We want peace in Yemen. We're fed up. We're tired of war. And we want to engage. And we want to use you and your connection to the European Union. And they met my colleagues. We introduced them to a number of people, Petrus in particular, one of my colleagues from the New Europe, and they would take this up. They're the sort of things that we should be helping. Because I tell you, that news film moved people. Jeremy Boyne did it, and he's very good when he does his reports. And these are young children starving. And you telling me that we should be helping them? That's, you know, that for me is what we're about. You know, forget your party politics. You know, as Britain, we've always shown compassion. And regardless of whether our government wants to pull out a DFID or not, whenever there's a disasters emergency committee appeal, you can see how, as a country, we respond. So the government might want to turn our back. There's been lots of them that are wanting to get rid of that budget and just don't want to kind of give aid. I'm not saying that every time we spent £1, it's been spent wisely. There's been some silly expenditure, funding countries that got space programs, but then giving them economic, development aid. There are reform required, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think this smash and burn thing, the way I look at Cummings, and I look at Farage, and I look at Trump, they don't like a rule-based system. They just want to trash everything and just then allow people to kind of fend for themselves. And what will happen is the weak will just be they'll wither away and the strong will prosper. And that's who they think are their masters. And, that's why they want to pull us out of, European Union. They want us to pull out of all the international agreements. They want to just have a deal between the UK and America, because Trump wants a deal because they like deals. But actually these things matter. I think for the people that are likely to vote Liberal Democrat, international aid will be important. And I think as a party, we should, whoever the leader is, in end of August, whoever the leader is, one of the things they should be doing it right now, actually, is challenging the likes of Johnson, challenging Priti Patel to say, look, hang on, you're Home Secretary now, but you used to be the International Development Secretary. Can't you see what the negativities are, what you're trying to do, and challenge all the other people in the Conservative Party? There's plenty of them that will see the benefits. They're obviously keeping their heads down at the moment.
And it should be a clear policy of ours that the first thing we'll do as soon as the election's over, and hopefully we're part of some kind of government, is reinstate DFID and look at this as a short-term thing that it's going to bite the dust now. But we are at most 4 years away from an election. And, sadly, in the scheme of these things, 4 years is actually not that long. For these countries that are really struggling, they're still going to be struggling in 4 years' time. And we say that, we'll reconstitute it straight away. All that expertise will be there. It's one of the things I regret most about having lost my job in Brussels was I was the vice chair, I think, one of these silly titles of delegation to the Arabian Peninsula. I think that's what they called it. But it included Yemen. And, at some point I would have gone to Yemen on a fact-finding mission, and I would have seen for myself how awful it was. And, that was the kind of work that I was really interested in and really wanted to do. And, working across Saudi and Qatar and these places on human rights and rights for women. And, we're not part of that anymore, and that's just heartbreaking, really, because it's important that we are, especially if our government is going to get rid of DFID. If we still had our place in Europe, then at least we would be able to be involved on a European level. But
something I think we need to look out for, and foreshadowed this, was Conservatives, I mean that widely, the sort of Conservative commentators as well as the politicians, is now attacking other international institutions who over the next few years will become their new scapegoats, and the things they want to dismantle. Would it be the UN, the WHO, particularly if Trump is re-elected, which I desperately hope he isn't, because that's part of his ethos. And I think the extent of Russian influence on the Conservative Party, which there seems to be more and more evidence about all the time. You've got the suppression of the Russia report, but you've also got connections between cabinet ministers and donors who are connected directly to Putin. And the Putin view of the world is entirely about great powers competing with each other with no framework of rules, as we've known them for about 100 years in the West and indeed the wider world. So I think a big theme for the party over the next 4 years needs to be, in opposing the Conservatives, is that we're the champions of internationalism, in cooperation. And hopefully, exactly as Caroline said, that leads to us being in a government of some kind. Because if you look at the next general election, the maths works very easily for the Conservatives losing. They need to lose 40 seats, probably 50 when you take into account first term incumbency. And there's, by historical precedent, about a 50-50 chance of that will happen. I mean, losing 50 seats is quite a lot. Governments often don't do that. But for Labour to win a majority is basically impossible, especially when they're on their knees in Scotland. Can they win 120 seats in England? Well, winning 120 seats in the UK is a once in 50-year thing. Winning 120 seats just in England and Wales is impossible to imagine that happening. So a hung parliament in 4 years' time is very likely. And I think if the Lib Dems are in a position of strength there, we need to be really clear about demanding certain things. And one of those things should be that the new government has commitments to internationalism, such as bringing back DFID.
I am becoming more and more convinced that Trump won't win the election in November. And there's even talk that he might not even stand for election in November, and they might find some reason for him not to be the candidate. And I think if the Democrats, if you think back to 2015 when Trump was elected, and everything started going wrong, and we all said, oh, Trump surely won't win the presidency, and he did. And then it was like, we're not going to lose this referendum, and we did, and so on and so forth. I personally like to see if the Democrats win in November, that could be the start of a shift. It'll be a shift in the narrative. It'll be a shift in the conversation. If we had someone who spoke the way Obama did about things like international issues and cooperation and the climate, then all of that will focus. Will show up the contrast more with the Conservatives, who are not speaking from that crib sheet, and we will be able to say, it'll make it more apparent how uncooperative they are on the international stage, and how unwilling they are to take the measures necessary for climate change and all that kind of stuff, which can only help us in the long run.
And just before Sheila comes in, I had a little chat with it was one of it was Preston for Europe, one of these pro-EU groups, and I raised the issue that in regard to trade, obviously everyone wants Trump to lose, but there's a weird kind of issue that might happen, that if Trump does lose and Biden becomes president, the idea of a trade deal which would still be horrendous to British suppliers, farmers, industries, etc., might get a more palatable pill as opposed to a Trump, because everyone knows what Trump's like, this America first nonsense. But actually, trade negotiations are brutal. They're not easy kind of affairs anyway, and we might get lulled into a slight kind of, oh, it's Biden, it's the Democrats, it won't be as bad as Trump and the Republicans, when actually it would all be pretty rubbish. And it would all hurt the British industries. But that was just something that came up, and I was certainly making that point at that meeting. But Sheila, what are your views on the future?
I think it is extremely. A week is a long time in politics, guys, and we're looking forward over 4 years, because let's face it, there is nothing that is going to bring down this Conservative government with the majority of the size they've got at the current moment. Notwithstanding the fact that half of social media thinks they just shout loud enough and Boris will cave. And actually, half of social media doesn't seem to realise we have actually left the European Union. That's another issue. If we were about to fight a general election in today's circumstances, I would expect our parliamentary strength to increase. Let's be realistic about how much it might increase. I would expect Labour's parliamentary strength to increase, and I would expect the Tories to lose overall control. I think it would be absolutely bonkers for us to contemplate setting out a stall in advance of that. I think that has crippled us at every election in which we've done that. We might want to have our own internal views about where that is going to go, but we absolutely have got to stop fighting elections on the basis that we will hold the balance of power and demand X, Y, or Z. It's a total nonsense and utterly destructive as far as the electorate is concerned.
And from that, I suppose that comes out, one of the questions that comes up a lot on Lib Dem debate groups and everything else is rejoining the EU. Now, again, I've said quite publicly on this podcast that I think if you have that argument now, you lose for longer. And actually, we have to accept the fact we are leaving. We don't have to like it, and we can fight for better deals and better economic cooperation. But actually, if Lib Dems go into the 2024 election campaigning to rejoin, I think we just get a walloping again, and it might put back, rejoining efforts in say 10 years or something. But Sheila, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think we should have a policy, which is in our manifesto, about rejoining the European Union. And I think if we put it on a single leaflet, we will do ourselves damage. We need to be able to say to the people, and there are a lot of people, both inside and outside the party, who are keen on the European Union, that the Liberal Democrats are pro-European, we are pro-internationalist, and we want to rejoin the European Union. But it should not be a campaigning platform for us. I actually saw some data this morning which suggests that many of our own more recent members are still very focused on the Brexit arguments, and we mustn't, and we have no reason to lose those people. We need to be clear that we are opposed to Brexit, we want an extension, we want the best trade deal possible, and we want to rejoin as soon as it is absolutely feasible. But it absolutely should not be on a leaflet, it should not be in our social media, and we should not be campaigning on that platform. I'm going to say right now, in these circumstances, I would want to review that on a 6-monthly basis between now and a general election.
I was going to say just there, I think we need to see how things go over the next 4 years, and a week's a long time and 4 years is a long time, as Sheila says. I think we need to see where the country is when we start approaching the next general election in the spring of 2024. I mean, by then we'll have 3 or 4 years worth of data, or 3 or 4 years worth of personal experience for people about how Brexit has worked out. And I think we can decide in 2024, probably in the early part of that year, what we want to say about Europe and indeed every other political issue. And there's no necessity to write the manifesto at this stage. I think what we can do that's constructive is to explore amongst ourselves different possible policies that the next government could have, or different possible stances we might take in the election. And a stance has got to be one that's true to your values and your principles, and which makes a connection with the electorate. And different possibilities that I've heard people mention are that the policy we could put forward would be to have a review, because we would have 4 or 5 years of data. Let's have an independent review of how Brexit has worked out. Or a phrase that I've heard used, I think people, the public would agree with, is the next generation should have their chance to have their say, because most people know that young people overwhelmingly voted to be in Europe. And I've even met older people who voted leave, but that's very much on their minds, and they have a sense of fair play, and it just ain't cricket that they've made a decision that their grandchildren will have to live with much longer. And of course, the next government will, if there is a change of government, will take power in 2024. 2026 will come around very quickly. Suddenly it's a decade since the last referendum. It might be the case that there's a mood in the country that says, yeah, let's reconsider this by that point.
John, when we were leaving Europe, I think all of us were in a room together. I think I remember this and others, that we thought, now we're going to be leaving on the 31st of Jan. What do we do? Start a campaign to join the day after? And I didn't see much appetite there. And the point I want to make is that Europe's not going to stand still either. You know, in the next year or two, there's going to be this conference about the future of Europe itself that Guy and others are going to be involved in. So Europe's going to change. And, you know, I think there will be a debate. There will be a debate in the run-up to the general election, 2024 or earlier, about what our relationship with Europe could be. And Anthony's right that question, no doubt, will be asked in the next parliament, not this parliament, the next one. And like you say, it'll be 10 years, and we will be able to then see where Europe is. Let's see where the world is. You know, the world is growing, and you know, we kind of have to look at what our relationships we will have to have, not just with Europe but elsewhere. You know, the former Commonwealth, you've got some economic powers there. Countries like Indonesia got a massive population, Brazil, etc. You know, as a you know, UK, we will have to have some relationships with those still, because we're going to be out of Europe. In the past, we relied upon the European Union negotiating our relationships with these countries. You know, the EU recently had an EU-China summit, You know, we're not going to be part of those anymore now. So there's a clear kind of a lot of work to be done. Sorry, Caroline, you wanted to come in.
No, I was just going to say that I think the conversations are already happening in the union that, you know, the reaction of the European Union to the pandemic showed up that there were some issues with the union. They didn't all act as one. They immediately sort of went back to nation state and had different policies on the borders and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's made them think about what they want the union to be and how they want it to go forward. So in 5 years' time, it might look a bit different to the union that we left. But I think as Liberal Democrats, if we start campaigning now to rejoin, frankly, we're just going to look a bit batty. You know, there are a lot of people who marched, you know, with their blue berets on, who are total sort of EU fanatics, and it is the most important issue they can think of. But they're not that many, and I think it's, you know, and it's not just the European Union conversation. There are lots of conversations that Lib Dems have, particularly within the party, that really focus on quite narrow interest groups. And I think what Labour does so well is it talks about the big issues. You know, it talks about the NHS, which everybody in the country has an interest in or cares about. Whereas, you know, we focus on these issues which don't have such broad appeal. And I think it's really important that in our manifesto, like Sheila says, we say, you know, the Liberal Democrats believe in rejoining the European Union, because ultimately we do, and we probably will continue to do that. But, you know, let's campaign on issues which are, you know, have a broad appeal and which will, you know, interest more of the electorate. You know, so like we're having this conversation at the moment around people, about social care and people, unpaid carers, you know, who are doing a huge job of work that is not rewarded, and there are millions and millions of them, far more than people who care at the moment so much about the European Union, I think.
I suppose a final point to kind of end this discussion is when I spoke to three of you in January, and there was varying levels of anger at Lib Dem performance in the general election and the strategy. And since then, obviously, we've had the Thornhill review, and now we're having a leadership election. Now, this is completely up to you. I have to stay neutral as part of my Lib Dem podcasting, but I do know some of you have come out in favour of a particular candidate, but this is your chance to say, okay, what do you want to see going forward? Whether that's Ed, Layla, or whomever.
Right, well, I have not entirely made up my mind. I am leaning in a particular direction, but I'm not quite at the stage of publicly saying I am supporting or not supporting. I think there are significant merits with both candidates. I think there are issues surrounding both candidates, and I think for me the discussion is still in the balance. I would like to see internally from either of them, and I don't think either of them have done this, I'd like to see some evidence of leadership. I'd like to understand where they want to lead the party towards, and indeed how they want to lead the party in that direction. Both of them are very focused on the external stuff, and clearly that's important. I mean, where they take the Liberal Democrats is an important part of doing their job. But as far as the internal election is concerned, I'd like to understand more about their position on leadership. I have little doubt that our task for the next 4 years is rebuilding from the grassroots up. I think that is partly implicit, partly explicit in the Thornhill review. We can't fight parliamentary seats at the scale at which we want to do it unless we have the infrastructure in those seats to do it. And Dorothy Thornhill says that absolutely clearly. I know that FCEC is working on a tiered campaign so that no seat is left without a route map forward. Route map is becoming a bit of a cliche these days, but no seat is left behind without something to aspire to, and I think that's absolutely the right way to be doing that. We're already working through stuff like that in Scotland, and I hope to have a federal leader who supports us in those ambitions.
Okay, who wants to go next?
I'll go next. So I'm supporting Ed Davey. I supported him last time. I'm supporting him this time. The reason I'm going with Ed is because I think he's got the experience of having been in Parliament for a long time and having been a member of the party for a very long time. He knows the party inside out. He was instrumental in getting Dorothy Thornhill to do the review, and I believe that he will be instrumental in making that review happen and not having it sitting on a shelf. I think he wants to change the way we campaign as a party, and I think he probably has the gravitas and the contacts in the party and the support in the party to be able to make internal changes, which we need if we're going to be a fighting machine at the next election. But also, I don't think this argument about us sort of getting rid of the coalition and having a leader who is not part of the coalition, I don't believe that will make a massive change, because I don't believe that in an interview with someone like Andrew Neil, if he challenges Layla about the coalition, I don't think it's a sufficient answer to say, oh, well, I wasn't part of it, so it's nothing to do with me, because she would be leading the party that was in the coalition. And I think actually it's much more powerful for us to have a leader who can say, yes, I was in that coalition and we did some really good things, and look at the wind energy, look at the green, the progress we made on environmental issues, look at the pupil premium that we introduced, which has helped, all those things. There were positive things we did in the coalition, and I think that Ed will be really good at selling those things and saying, I'm not embarrassed about it and I'm not going to apologise for it. That is something that the momentum side of Labour wants us to do, and it's the position they are putting us in. Whereas we need to say, actually, we believe in coalition governments. If we want PR, we're always going to have a coalition government. So we have to be bold and say, we did some really good things in that government, and try and divert that conversation towards those things. So I think he could sell that. And yeah, I've known him 25 years. He got drunk at my wedding. Ed's an old friend of mine. So I'm backing Ed.
And I suppose, Anthony, you have come out in favour of Layla. Now, you don't have to talk about Layla. You can talk about I remember when we talked, you were one of the first MEPs I talked to, and you were very cross at what had happened during the general election, and were very keen on putting your opinions forward to the Thornhill review. So what's next steps for the Lib Dems for you, Anthony?
I thought the Thornhill review was excellent, and it needs to be implemented in full and thoroughly. And don't underestimate that implementation is going to be really difficult, because there are people who are very accustomed to things being done a certain way, who have a certain comfort with the way things are, and they will push back. That establishment will push back very hard against any change, because some people would just happily tick along with the way things are rather than a big change. I'm supporting Layla for a number of reasons. First of all, what I think her team have done in Oxford West Abington is amazing. Remember, we didn't win that seat even in 2010. We hadn't won it since 2005. So she became the PPC. And sometimes people think she was an all-women shortlist candidate, but she wasn't. She was selected in 2012 before all-women shortlists came in, up against a first-time incumbent Conservative with a 7,000 majority, and reduced that. Well, didn't quite make it in 2015, and then stayed on and won the seat in 2017, and turned in 2019 with a 9 or 10,000 now Lib Dem majority. And what they've done really well in Oxford is build up the local party they've now got a membership, I think 1,000 or something like that. It's one of the biggest local parties in the country, really strong local government base, but also reach out, because it's quite easy if your target seat PPC, sometimes they can be a bit selfish and say to the whole county or area around them, come into the target seat, this is the place that matters. But actually what Oxford West have done really well is export their excellence into other parts of Oxfordshire. So Oxfordshire as a county is now a really strong area that had some other target seats that in a better general election could have been won as well. Also, I really like the fact that Layla was a school teacher, the fact she's not just been a politician her whole life. I think that experience of helping young people and families from all backgrounds is a great part of her skill set, and that gives her cut through. I mean, even though she's not the interim leader, she's been on the front pages of different newspapers several times over recent months. She comes over really well on shows like Question Time and the news, and I think up against Boris Johnson on one side and Keir Starmer on the other, be frank, two middle-aged white blokes. She is really distinctive. She sounds interesting. Her background is different. And I think she'll be listened to, and the media will want to go to her because she'll add something to TV news programs, which will give us more attention. And I think the coalition part of it is important for me. I think we desperately need to move on from the coalition. And Michael Steed, who's a professor of politics at Manchester, retired. He was party president in the 70s. He's done some really good analysis in Liberator. And his view was that even in 2019, the coalition was a bigger drag on our support than even more recent factors. And I think what Labour will be able to do is not only will she say, I wasn't an MP during the coalition, but she will say, because I know she does, disagree with things the coalition did. And she said so at the time. There's an episode of Question Time where she's there as a member of the public in the audience saying the health and social care bill is a bad idea, the one that, there was a conference rebellion about. She opposed tuition fees at the time, and I strongly disagree with what the coalition did on tuition fees. I think breaking that promise was the wrong thing to do, because it's always wrong to break promises. And even if Nick Clegg seemed to take the view that the policy had was the wrong one, the right thing to do is not to break your promise, it's to offer a different policy at the next general election. So I think in terms of rebuilding the trust that we've lost with people, Labour is by far the best candidate to do that.
And I suppose the last word with Shaffaq, which if that doesn't become the name of your podcast, Shaffaq, I don't know what is, but go over to you to finish us off for this discussion.
Look, I mean, I was part of the general election review, so we had over 22,000 submissions from people. A lot of reading to be done there. And obviously, Anthony's right, lots of people were angry about the results. We expected to do better, we didn't. There were a lot of factors involved in this, the presidential style election, the fact that people expected Joe to do so well on television, and then it didn't transpire that way. So actually what we need, I mean, I'm looking back, I mean, me and Andrew Stunnell did a lot of the work around the groundwork, the local campaign stuff. Those that know me and Andrew, when they read the review, they said, we know which bit you were involved in, what you wrote. And I think we're going to go back to understanding how we have won. How did we win Sheffield Hallam? How did we win elsewhere up and down the country? And that was down to local campaigning, building up your base, mobilising your activists, inspiring your activists, getting involved, having a councillor base, from there having a good PPC who's not going to just rely upon the national message. I mean, I was talking to Nick on a Zoom call on Friday, and one of the things we spoke about was a little thing we did for Sheffield members, is that you can't just win on Lib Dem votes. You've got to get other parties to come and join you, and we, if we look at how we rebuild our party, look at where our second places are, and predominantly the Conservatives. And I agree with Ed, and that's why I'm backing Ed. I backed Ed last time, I'm backing Ed this time, is that we've got to reach out to those soft Conservatives, and we don't do that by being even more left than Labour is at the moment. And that's why I think it's really important that, in my view, that we elect Ed as the leader. We could then go forward, rebuild our base, rebuild from the councils, counties, districts, wherever, and then support and actually have a sensible targeting strategy. The last strategy was bonkers. 40 seats, another 40, last I'd add 100. And I remember joking at the time, I was slightly detached because all those guys were in Europe, we were coming back, and we were going to different places. And I'm thinking, God, if it's this easy to win, why are we just targeting 100 more seats? Why not 200 seats? And I remember saying, actually, is this going to be a bit like Cleggmania, where we get really excited and actually then we don't get the result we think? So I just think that we've got to be realistic in our targeting. Like Caroline, I've known Ed since when I first got elected in 2004. He's got a fantastic personal story around his upbringing in Mansfield, some of the challenges that he's had in life. And I just think the party needs a bit of stability at the moment, a familiar face, a face that everyone knows. We know where the opposition will attack it, but I actually think we need someone who's going to empower the local campaigns, because I think that's what's going to counter the presidential campaign of Starmer versus Johnson or whoever next time, is that we've got to have a strong local message of why we should vote for somebody in Cheadle, i.e. Tom Morrison, as opposed to just vote Lib Dem. And I think Ed will be that candidate that inspires that much more localised campaign. And that's my parting shot, John.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for being on the show. We really appreciate it. And your time you've given up to be on. It's brilliant. And like I said, you all came back virtually straight away and said, yeah, we're happy to be on again. So it's fantastic that you've given up your time for us. And to all our listeners and viewers, because last time these guys were on, we weren't doing viewing. This is the modern technology and Zoom has come about. So we can now do video conferences. So do subscribe to us on YouTube. Do follow us on our Facebook page and other social media. Do go check out all these guys on their social media as well. They're always worth a listen to. Thank you so much for listening. Do subscribe, and we'll have another episode very soon.